I used to think marriage was forever. You find someone, you love them, you settle down, and that's it, right? But that's not how it went with me and Marcy. Things started going downhill way before Glenda was even born. At first, it was just little stuff, you know? Like, she'd come home from work later than usual, saying she had a meeting or something. She'd be on edge, like she couldn't stand being around me anymore. Marcy always had something to say, something to complain about. If it wasn't my long hours at the office, it was that I didn't help enough with the baby or that I wasn't romantic anymore. Whatever I did, it wasn't enough. Looking back, the signs were all there. I just didn't want to see them. I guess I wanted to believe we could fix things, for Glenda's sake. But after Glenda was born, Marcy changed. She barely looked at me, spent more time out of the house, and when she was home, it felt like I wasn't even there. We'd have these stupid arguments about nothing. I don't even remember what half of them were about now, just that they always left me feeling like crap. One day, she was getting ready for some work event. She came downstairs, looking all done up, more than usual. I remember asking her why she was putting in so much effort, and she just snapped at me. Said something about how I never appreciated anything she did anymore. I didn't push it. That was a mistake. I tried to brush it off after that night, but something felt off. She'd always been distant, but this was different. There was this coldness between us that I couldn't shake. I started noticing how much time she spent on her phone. Always texting, always glued to it like whatever was going on there was more important than me or Glenda. One night, I asked her who she was always talking to. She just rolled her eyes, called me paranoid, and stormed off. It wasn't like I was checking her phone or anything. I'm not that guy, but her reaction? That hit different. Around this time, Janet Logan started reaching out to me. Janet was the widow of Robert, Marcy's old boss. We had never been close or anything, but we'd see each other at company events, and she was always nice enough. After Robert passed, we exchanged a few messages, just the usual condolences, but then she asked if we could meet up for coffee. I thought it was a bit odd, but I went. Janet was grieving, and I figured maybe she just needed someone to talk to. What I wasn't prepared for was the bomb she dropped on me. Sitting there across from me, stirring her coffee like she didn't just blow my entire world apart, Janet told me that Marcy and Robert had an affair. I couldn't even speak. It felt like someone had punched me in the gut. All I could do was sit there and listen as Janet laid it all out. Marcy and Robert had been together for a while, off and on, apparently around the time Glenda was born. And then Janet said something that made my head spin. Marcy had believed Glenda might be Robert's daughter. I barely remember driving home that day. My head was spinning. Everything Janet said kept replaying in my mind. How could Marcy believe Glenda wasn't mine? How could she even doubt something like that? When I got home, Marcy was already there, sitting at the kitchen table like everything was normal. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her. It was like looking at a stranger. My hands were shaking, but I kept it together long enough to sit across from her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. She glanced up, clearly annoyed. "About what now, Grady?" "Another thing I've done wrong." That was it. That attitude. The way she acted like I was the problem. I couldn't hold back anymore. "I talked to Janet today," I said, watching her face closely. At first, nothing. But when I mentioned Janet's name, I saw it, the flicker of panic. She tried to cover it up, leaning back in her chair like she wasn't fazed, but I knew. I knew right then she was hiding something. "What did Janet say?" Marcy asked, her voice cold. "She told me about you and Robert. About the affair." Silence. Dead silence. For a second, I thought she might deny it, try to spin some lie, but instead, she just stared at me. The anger drained from her face, replaced with something else, something I couldn't quite read. "And," she finally said, like this wasn't the bombshell that had just shattered my life. "And." I almost laughed. "Is it true, Marcy? Did you really have an affair with Robert? Did you think Glenda might be his?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up, went to the fridge, and poured herself a glass of water like we were talking about the weather. She took a sip before turning back to me. "It was a mistake," she said flatly. "But yes, it happened. And yes, I thought for a while Glenda might be his." I didn't even know what to say. My throat tightened, and all I could feel was this cold wave of betrayal crashing over me. I sat there staring at her, waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, anything, but she just stood there, sipping her water like she hadn't just ripped my life apart. A mistake. I finally said, my voice shaking. You call that a mistake? You thought Glenda wasn't even mine, Marcy. How the hell do you keep something like that from me? She didn't flinch, didn't look guilty, nothing. Instead, she crossed her arms and leaned against the counter. I didn't think you needed to know, she said, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Robert's dead now. What's the point in digging all this up? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, my wife, had been carrying on an affair while I was working my ass off to provide for our family. She'd lied to me for years, even letting me believe Glenda wasn't mine. And now, she had the nerve to act like it didn't matter? Glenda deserves the truth, I said, standing up. I deserve the truth. She rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic, Grady. Glenda is yours, all right? I found out after Robert died that he was sterile. There's no way she could be his. The room spun. I gripped the back of the chair, trying to process what she just said. Robert was sterile. That meant Glenda was mine. I had spent years wondering why Marcy was so distant, why she treated me like an outsider in my own home. All this time, she had been holding on to this sick belief that our daughter wasn't even mine. How long were you going to keep this up? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Were you ever going to tell me? Marcy shrugged. I didn't see the point. It's not like it changes anything now. You're still Glenda's father. That was it. That was all she had to say. I felt sick, like I didn't even know the person standing in front of me anymore. Get out, I said suddenly, my voice hard. I can't even look at you right now. She didn't move. Instead, she gave me this look, like I was the one being unreasonable. What? You're going to throw me out of the house now? Over something that happened years ago. I clenched my fists, trying to keep myself from losing it completely. You lied to me for years, Marcy. You kept this from me. You treated me like a fool. And now, you're standing there acting like none of this matters. For the first time, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe fear, but she quickly buried it. Fine, she muttered, grabbing her keys. I'll stay at my sister's for the night. She stormed out without another word, slamming the door behind her. The silence that followed was suffocating. I collapsed into the chair, my mind racing. Glenda was mine. She had always been mine. But I had lost years I'd spent wondering, doubting, all because of Marcy's lies. The house was too quiet after Marcy left. I sat there for a long time, trying to wrap my head around everything. Glenda was mine, but that didn't take away the years of lies, the years of Marcy treating me like I was some kind of placeholder in her life. The next morning, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit in the wreckage of our marriage, pretending everything would somehow fix itself. I needed answers, and I needed to protect myself, and Glenda. I called a lawyer. That's when I remembered something Marcy probably forgot about. Years ago, back when she was deep in the affair with Robert, she'd signed some papers. At the time, it was just some precautionary agreement Robert had insisted on to keep their relationship discreet. Marcy, eager to keep her little secret, signed without thinking twice. I didn't know what I was going to do with that yet, but I kept it in mind. If this thing was heading toward divorce, I wasn't going to be the one left out in the cold. A couple of days passed, and Marcy stayed away. Fine by me. I needed time to think. But more importantly, I needed to be smart about this. Glenda was my daughter. That was the one thing I could hold on to in the middle of all this mess. And I wasn't going to let Marcy take her from me, no matter how much she tried to play the victim. It was about a week later when Janet called me again. She'd found something that would change everything. I think you should get a paternity test, she said, her voice quiet on the phone. I don't need to, I replied. You already told me Robert was sterile. That's true, Janet said. But you need to prove it legally. For your sake and for Glenda's. She was right. If Marcy tried to fight for custody later, she might spin all kinds of stories to paint me as the bad guy. The only way I'd stand a chance was if I had proof that Glenda was biologically mine. Janet's words stuck with me. I needed proof. I couldn't leave anything to chance, not with Marcy. I'd seen how manipulative she could be, how easily she twisted things when it suited her. If this turned into a fight over Glenda, I couldn't afford any loose ends. I scheduled the paternity test the next day. I didn't tell Marcy about it. She was still staying at her sister's place, and honestly, I preferred it that way. I needed the space to think clearly. The test itself was quick, just a swab from me and Glenda. I told her it was just something routine for school paperwork, and she didn't question it. It felt weird, standing there, swabbing the mouth of the daughter I had raised since birth, knowing I had to prove she was mine. But I did it, because I couldn't take any more risks. A few days later, the results came back. Glenda was 100% my daughter. Seeing that on paper felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. There was no more doubt, no more wondering. Whatever else Marcy had done, Glenda was mine. That evening, Marcy showed up at the house, acting like she was ready to talk. She walked in like she still owned the place, like nothing had really changed. "I think we should figure this out," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table like she had any say left in this mess. For Glenda's sake. I stared at her for a long moment, barely able to contain my anger. "Oh, now you want to talk about what's good for Glenda?" Marcy sighed, like I was the one being difficult. "Look, I know I made mistakes, okay? But that doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. We've been together for years, Grady. We can get through this." Her tone was almost casual, like she wasn't the same person who had lied to me for years, who had questioned if our daughter even belonged to me. But I wasn't going to play that game anymore. "I already got a paternity test," I said, watching her reaction closely. Marcy's face tightened, her eyes narrowing. "You what?" "You heard me. Glenda's mine, and now I've got the proof. So if you think you're going to take her away from me or use this mess to get what you want, think again." For the first time, I saw panic in her eyes. She tried to cover it up, but I knew her too well. She wasn't expecting that. "You're overreacting," she said quickly, standing up. "I never said I'd take Glenda from you. We could have handled this without lawyers and tests." "Yeah," I said, leaning forward. "Like you handled your affair with Robert." She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. For the first time, she was speechless. Marcy stood there, frozen, and for once, she had nothing to say. I wasn't sure if it was guilt or fear that finally shut her up, but I didn't care. I had what I needed. Glenda was mine, and Marcy knew that meant she'd lost the one card she could have played. "I want a divorce," I said, the words finally spilling out. I didn't even hesitate. She blinked, like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. "Grady, don't be ridiculous. We've had problems, but we can fix this. People go through things, they work it out." I shook my head. "No, Marcy. This isn't something we work out. You lied, you cheated, and you spent years making me think Glenda might not be mine. You don't come back from that." She crossed her arms, trying to look tough, but I could see through her. "So that's it? You're just going to throw away our whole marriage?" I almost laughed at the nerve she had. "You threw it away a long time ago, Marcy. I'm just cleaning up what's left." For a moment, I thought she might cry, might show some real emotion, but instead, her expression hardened. She didn't care about me or what I felt. It was about control, and now she was losing it. "Fine," she snapped. "You want a divorce? We'll see what a judge has to say about that. I'll fight for Glenda. You think you can just take her from me?" I leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of calm. "Go ahead, Marcy. Fight all you want. I've got the paternity test, and I've got the old papers you signed when you were still with Robert. Remember those?" Her face went pale. She remembered. "You didn't think I'd keep those, did you?" I continued, not hiding the satisfaction in my voice. "You gave up your rights back then, when you were so caught up in your little affair. It might have been years ago, but those papers still hold up. So, good luck trying to take Glenda." For the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she was trying to think of a way out of this, but there wasn't one. She'd lost. "Grady, this isn't fair," she said, her voice trembling now. "I'm still her mother." "Yeah, well, maybe you should have thought about that before you lied to me for years." After that confrontation, things moved fast. I filed for divorce within the week. My lawyer had all the leverage we needed, the paternity test proving Glenda was mine and those old custody papers Marcy signed when she was wrapped up in her affair with Robert. I wasn't playing games anymore. For too long, I had let her lies twist my life, but not anymore. Now, I was the one in control. Marcy, of course, didn't take it well. She tried to act like she was fine at first, but I could tell she was scrambling behind the scenes. I started getting calls from her lawyer, trying to negotiate, trying to get me to reconsider the custody arrangement. I didn't budge. I knew she'd try to use Glenda to worm her way back in, but I wasn't about to let that happen. The first time we sat down in mediation, Marcy was all smiles, acting like we could work this out amicably. She leaned into the whole mother routine, saying how she only wanted what was best for Glenda, how she didn't want to drag things out for her sake. I let her talk. I could see through the performance. When she finally finished her little speech, I laid it all out, everything. The affair, the signed custody papers, the paternity test. I watched her face fall, bit by bit, as her lawyer looked through the documents, realizing just how badly she had screwed up. "You don't have a case, Marcy," I said bluntly. "You signed away your custody rights years ago. I've got proof Glenda's mine, and I'm not giving her up." Her lawyer tried to recover, throwing out some legal jargon about how the documents might not hold up or how Marcy had changed since then, but it was weak. I knew it, and so did she. Marcy's smile disappeared completely. "You're really going to do this?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "I am." Glenda was the reason I kept pushing forward. I wasn't about to let Marcy mess up her life with the same lies she used on me. After the meeting, things got uglier. Marcy started playing dirty, trying to paint me as some kind of absent father, claiming I worked too much, that I didn't spend enough time with Glenda. She even tried to say I wasn't emotionally present for her. It was laughable, honestly. She was the one who had been checked out of our marriage for years, but now, she wanted to pretend like she cared? But here's the thing, I was ready for it. I kept everything documented, the time I spent with Glenda, how I made sure her schoolwork was done, how I took her to every doctor's appointment. Marcy didn't have a leg to stand on, and I made sure she knew it. Things went from bad to worse after that. Marcy wasn't about to give up, not without making things as messy as possible. She ramped up her fight for custody, showing up at the house more, trying to act like the perfect mother every chance she got. But it was all an act, and I knew it. The court hearings were draining. Marcy's lawyer kept pushing the narrative that she was the better parent, trying to paint me as some workaholic who was barely around. I sat there, listening to her lie, twisting everything to make it seem like I was the one who didn't care about Glenda. But I didn't let it get to me. I knew the truth, and I had the evidence to back it up. It wasn't just the paternity test or the old custody agreement. I'd been keeping records for months, proof of the time I spent with Glenda, photos of us together, school reports, doctor visits, everything. Every lie Marcy threw out, I had a way to knock it down. When I took the stand, I made sure to stay calm, no matter how much Marcy's lawyer tried to provoke me. They asked about my work schedule, trying to make it sound like I was never home. I told them the truth. I worked hard, yes, but I always made time for my daughter. That's what mattered. Then came the paternity test. My lawyer presented it, and I watched Marcy's face fall as the results were read in court. Glenda was mine, no question about it. All the doubt Marcy had tried to stir up fell flat. After that, it was just a matter of time. The judge wasn't buying Marcy's act anymore, and the paper she signed during her affair sealed her fate. I was awarded full custody of Glenda, and Marcy was left with visitation rights. When the ruling came down, Marcy lost it. She tried to argue, tried to beg the judge to reconsider, but it was over. She had lost. When we left the courtroom that day, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. It was over. I had won, but at the same time, I knew Glenda's life was going to change. She'd never see Marcy the same way again. But I wasn't going to let Marcy's mistakes ruin my relationship with my daughter. After the court battle, Marcy became more distant, almost like she was giving up. She'd pick Glenda up for her scheduled visits, but the fire in her was gone. She looked defeated, like she knew she'd lost more than just the custody fight. She'd lost everything that mattered. After the court battle, things slowly started to settle. Marcy still saw Glenda, but it wasn't the same. Glenda noticed the change too, even if she didn't fully understand it. She was just a kid, and I tried my best to keep things normal for her, but there was no hiding the tension between me and Marcy. I focused on being the best father I could be. I made sure I was there for every school event, every soccer game, every bedtime story. Glenda needed stability, and I was determined to give her that. I wasn't just a dad fighting for custody anymore, I was a dad, period. No more wondering if I was going to lose her. It was around this time that I started talking to Janet Logan more. At first, it was just about the court stuff. She'd check in to see how things were going, offer advice when I needed it. But slowly, our conversations shifted. We started talking about other things, life, family, what we'd both been through. There was something comforting about Janet. She knew betrayal just as deeply as I did. Robert's affair with Marcy had broken her too, in ways that only someone who had been through the same thing could understand. We connected over that shared pain, and before I knew it, I found myself looking forward to our talks. It wasn't long before those talks turned into coffee, then dinner. I didn't plan it, it just happened. There wasn't some big romantic moment. It was more like we both realized we didn't want to keep pretending like we were just friends. Janet made me feel grounded, like I could finally breathe again after everything I'd been through. We took things slow, especially because of Glenda. I wasn't about to throw her into another whirlwind. But the more time we spent together, the more I realized how much I cared about Janet. She wasn't just someone to talk to, she was someone who made me feel like I could rebuild my life. Of course, Marcy didn't take it well when she found out about Janet. She'd show up to pick up Glenda and make these snide comments, calling me out for moving on too fast or for parading Janet around. It was laughable, considering how she had torn our marriage apart with her affair. But Marcy couldn't stand to see me happy. It all came to a head one afternoon when she came by to drop off Glenda. She saw Janet's car parked in the driveway and lost it. "This is how you move on, huh?" she spat, storming up to the door. "Throw me out of Glenda's life, and then replace me with Janet?" I stood there, keeping my cool. "You know that's not what's happening, Marcy. Janet's not replacing anyone." Marcy crossed her arms, glaring. "You think Glenda's just going to accept this? That she's going to forget about everything and be okay with your little happy family?" I didn't take the bait. "Glenda's fine, and she's happy. That's what matters. You had your chance, Marcy, and you blew it. This is what happens." Her face twisted with anger, but she couldn't argue. She knew I was right. After that confrontation with Marcy, I thought maybe she'd back off, accept that things were different now. But of course, that wasn't her style. If anything, her behavior got worse. She started showing up late for her scheduled visits with Glenda, or sometimes not showing up at all. Glenda would sit by the window waiting, asking when her mom was coming, and I'd have to come up with excuses. I hated doing that, but I wasn't about to let Marcy's failures crush our daughter. It became clear Marcy was spiraling. The woman who used to pride herself on control, always holding the reins, always trying to manipulate, was unraveling. She lost her job a couple of months after the divorce was finalized. Something about being unreliable. I wasn't surprised, not after everything that had gone down, but still, it felt strange seeing her so broken. But even as her life was falling apart, she kept trying to cling to the one thing she thought she still had, Glenda. She filed for more visitation, claiming she wanted to rebuild the relationship with her daughter, but it was all for show. I could see through it. She wasn't trying to fix anything, she just couldn't stand the idea of losing more control. In one of our court-mandated co-parenting meetings, she showed up late, looking rough, hair a mess, eyes red, like she hadn't slept in days. The mediator could see it too. Marcy went on about how I was alienating her from Glenda, how I wasn't being fair. The same old lines she always used to make herself the victim. I let her rant, let her dig her own hole. After the meeting, as we were walking out, she cornered me in the parking lot. "You're not going to win this," she hissed, her voice shaky but still trying to sound threatening. "Glenda's my daughter too. You think you can just erase me?" I stood my ground. "I'm not trying to erase you, Marcy. But you're doing a pretty good job of that yourself." Her face twisted, but there was nothing left for her to say. She was losing her grip, and we both knew it. In the months that followed, things got worse for her. She started missing more of her visits with Glenda, showing up less and less. When she did come by, she seemed detached, barely making an effort. Glenda started asking fewer questions about when her mom would visit. I hated seeing her go through that, but at the same time, I wasn't about to force her into a relationship with someone who clearly wasn't invested anymore. One afternoon, Marcy didn't show up for her visit again. Glenda didn't even ask about it this time. We went about our day, but something felt off. Later that evening, I got a call from Marcy's sister. She was frantic, asking if I had heard from Marcy. "No," I said, concerned but not surprised. "Why?" "She's missing," her sister said quietly, her voice shaky. "I think something's wrong. She's been acting strange, like she's not herself. She lost her job, and now she won't answer her phone. I'm really worried." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. As much as Marcy had put me through, this wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want her to spiral like this, especially not for Glenda's sake. We both agreed to start looking, calling mutual friends, checking the usual places Marcy might go. It turned out, Marcy had just holed up at some cheap motel on the outskirts of town. She was fine physically, but she was a mess emotionally. Her sister went to pick her up, and I stayed out of it after that. It wasn't my place to save her anymore. But it became clear that Marcy was sinking, and there wasn't much anyone could do to stop it. Meanwhile, things between Janet and me were getting stronger. What started as late-night talks and dinners had turned into something more solid, something I hadn't realized I needed. Janet wasn't just a breath of fresh air, she was someone who made me believe in life again, in the possibility of a future that wasn't tied to the wreckage Marcy had left behind. One evening, we were sitting together on my porch, watching Glenda play in the yard. The sun was setting, casting this golden light over everything. Janet leaned her head on my shoulder, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. "You think we're doing the right thing?" Janet asked softly, her voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. I smiled, kissing the top of her head. "I do. More than anything." She nodded, her hand resting on mine. "It just feels strange sometimes. How everything turned out." "Strange but good," I said, squeezing her hand. "I never thought I'd get here, honestly." "Neither did I," she admitted, glancing at Glenda. "But I'm glad we found each other." We sat there, just watching Glenda laugh as she chased the dog around the yard, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. As time went on, life started to feel normal again. Not the kind of normal I had before, with Marcy and all her lies, but a new kind of normal. One that felt solid. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, it was about moving forward, about building something new with Janet and Glenda. Glenda had adapted better than I expected. She still saw Marcy, but the visits were fewer and farther between. I could tell she was starting to accept that her mom wasn't going to be as involved in her life as she had been before. It was hard watching her go through that, but I made sure she knew I was always there for her, that she could talk to me about anything. One evening, after dinner, Glenda asked me something that caught me off guard. "Dad, do you love Janet?" I paused, looking at her across the table. I hadn't expected that question, especially not from a 9-year-old. "Why do you ask?" Glenda shrugged, poking at her food. I see how happy you are when you're with her. And I like her too. She's nice." I smiled at her, feeling a lump in my throat. "Yeah, I do love her, Glenda. She makes me really happy." Glenda nodded, like she was processing something. "Does that mean you're gonna marry her?" I let out a small laugh, more out of surprise than anything else. I hadn't even thought that far ahead, honestly. Janet and I were just figuring things out as we went, but hearing Glenda ask that made me realize something. I did want that. I wanted a future with Janet. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Maybe one day. Would you be okay with that?" Glenda looked up at me, her eyes bright. "Yeah. I think it'd be nice." A couple of months later, I decided it was time to take the next step. Janet and I had been through enough together to know that we weren't just some rebound for each other. We had something real, something worth building on. One weekend, I took Glenda out for ice cream. It was just the two of us, and I figured it was a good time to talk about something that had been on my mind for a while. "Hey kiddo," I started, a little nervous. "How would you feel if Janet and I got married?" Glenda's eyes lit up. "Really?" I nodded. "Yeah. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I wanted to make sure you're okay with it. It's a big change, you know." She grinned, her face full of excitement. "I'd love that, Dad. Janet's awesome." I laughed, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "Good, because I think so too." That night, I sat down with Janet after Glenda had gone to bed. We were on the couch, just relaxing, when I finally worked up the nerve. "I've been thinking about us," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "About the future." Janet looked at me, a small smile on her face. "Oh yeah? What kind of future are we talking about?" "The kind where, maybe we make this official. You, me, and Glenda. A family. Her smile widened, and she reached for my hand. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I nodded, feeling my heart race. Yeah, I am. Janet, will you marry me? There wasn't some big, dramatic moment. No fancy dinner or fireworks. Just the two of us, sitting on the couch, quietly deciding that this was what we both wanted. Yes, she said softly, leaning in to kiss me. Of course I'll marry you. We kept it simple, just a small ceremony with close friends and family. Glenda was thrilled, acting as the flower girl and telling everyone who would listen about how her dad and Janet were getting married. Seeing her so happy made everything worth it. Marcy wasn't there, of course. By this point, she'd practically faded into the background. Her visits with Glenda had become even more sporadic, and she didn't seem to care much about what was going on in our lives. It was sad in a way, but it also felt like the final piece falling into place. About 6 months after the wedding, Janet had some news of her own. I'll never forget the look on her face when she told me. We were sitting in the kitchen, just like any other night, when she reached across the table and took my hand. Grady, she said, her voice soft but excited. I'm pregnant. I stared at her for a moment, processing the words. Pregnant. We were going to have a baby. Are you serious? I asked, my heart pounding. She nodded, tears of happiness filling her eyes. Yeah, I'm serious. I couldn't stop the grin that spread across my face. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight. This was it. A new beginning, a fresh start for both of us. Glenda was over the moon when we told her she was going to be a big sister. She had already settled into her role in our new family, and now with a baby on the way, it felt like everything had come full circle. Life had taken a turn I never expected, but for the first time in years, I felt at peace. I had a family that I loved, and we were building something beautiful together. Marcy was fading into the past, and while part of me still carried the scars of what she did, they didn't define me anymore. This was my life now. My family. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. After Janet told me she was pregnant, life seemed to fall into place. The three of us, soon to be 4, were settling into a rhythm. Glenda was excited to be a big sister, always asking questions about the baby and what it would be like. Janet glowed with happiness, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was happy too. Not just content or getting by, but truly happy. We were building something real. But as my life moved forward, Marcy's continued to spiral downward. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, which wasn't surprising. Her visits with Glenda were nearly non-existent by then. It was as if, after losing the custody battle and seeing me move on with Janet, she just gave up. The woman who had once fought tooth and nail for control of every little thing had lost all of it. One Saturday morning, I got a call from her sister again. I knew it was bad news before I even answered. It's Marcy, her sister said, her voice tired. She's in trouble, Grady. Real trouble this time. Apparently, Marcy had been caught driving under the influence. She'd crashed her car into a ditch, thankfully without hurting anyone, but it was enough to get her arrested. When I heard the news, I wasn't even angry. Just sad. Sad for what she had become. She needs help, her sister continued. I don't know what to do anymore. Maybe you can talk to her. I almost laughed at the idea. Me? Talk to her? After everything? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it wasn't about me or even about Marcy, it was about Glenda. No matter what Marcy had done, she was still Glenda's mother. And I didn't want Glenda to grow up wondering what happened to her mom, or worse, feeling like she was responsible for it. So, against my better judgment, I agreed to go see her. When I walked into the rehab facility, it felt surreal. Marcy looked like a shadow of the woman I used to know. Her hair was limp, her eyes dull, and there was none of the fire that used to define her. She sat across from me in the visiting area, fidgeting with her hands. Grady, she said quietly, barely looking up at me. Marcy, I replied, sitting down. There was a long, uncomfortable silence between us. I don't know what you want me to say, she muttered, her voice hoarse. You're probably here to say I told you so, right? I shook my head. No, Marcy. I'm not here for that. I'm here because of Glenda. She deserves better than this. At the mention of Glenda, something flickered in Marcy's eyes. Guilt, maybe, or shame. I know, she whispered, tears welling up. I know I've messed up. I don't know how to fix it. For the first time in years, she looked genuinely broken, not just angry or manipulative, but truly lost. And despite everything, a part of me felt for her. She had done horrible things, but she was still human. She was still Glenda's mother. If you want any kind of relationship with Glenda, you need to get your life together, I said firmly. She's already losing faith in you. You can't keep doing this, Marcy. She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. I know. I don't want her to hate me. She doesn't hate you, I said. But she's starting to forget what it's like to rely on you. And if you don't change that now, it'll be too late. I left that day not knowing if Marcy would actually change, but I hoped for Glenda's sake she would. It wasn't my responsibility to fix her, but it was my responsibility to protect Glenda from any more of Marcy's damage. A few weeks later, I got word that Marcy had checked herself into a longer-term treatment program. I wasn't holding my breath for a miraculous recovery, but it was a start. At least she was trying, and that was more than she had done in a long time. Meanwhile, life with Janet continued to grow. The baby was coming along, and we started preparing the nursery. Glenda was thrilled, picking out toys and clothes for her future sibling. Every night before bed, she talked to Janet's belly, telling stories to the baby. One evening, after Glenda had gone to bed, Janet and I sat on the couch, exhausted but happy. She rested her head on my shoulder, her hand on her growing belly. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" she asked softly. I thought about it for a moment. Sometimes. But mostly, I'm just glad it turned out this way. She smiled, leaning into me. Me too. We sat there in the quiet, just enjoying the peace we had built together. For so long, I had been stuck in the pain of Marcy's betrayal, but now, sitting here with Janet and thinking about our future, I realized that I had finally moved on. This was my life now, my family. And I was grateful for every moment of it. With Marcy in rehab and the baby on the way, life started to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it felt like the pieces were finally falling into place. Glenda was doing well in school, and she was adjusting to the idea of being a big sister. I could see the excitement in her eyes every time she talked about the baby, and it made me realize just how much things had changed for the better. One evening, a few months after my talk with Marcy, I got a call from her sister again. My stomach tightened, expecting more bad news, but this time, it wasn't. "Grady, Marcy's been doing better," her sister said. "She's out of the program now and staying with me." She asked if she could see Glenda. I sat there for a moment, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to protect Glenda from more disappointment. Marcy had let her down so many times before. But the other part of me knew that if Marcy was trying to get her life back on track, I couldn't stand in the way of her relationship with her daughter. "I'll talk to Glenda about it," I finally said. "If she's okay with it, we can set something up." I didn't want to force anything on Glenda. She was old enough now to understand the situation, and I wanted to respect her feelings. Later that night, after dinner, I sat her down in the living room. "Hey kiddo," I started gently. "Your mom's been working on getting better. She's out of rehab now, and she wants to see you. How do you feel about that?" Glenda's face was hard to read at first. She fiddled with her hands, thinking for a moment. "Is she really better?" she asked, her voice small. I sighed, not wanting to give her false hope. "She's trying. I think she wants to make things right." Glenda bit her lip, then nodded. "Okay. I want to see her." A week later, I arranged for Marcy to come by the house. I made sure Janet was out with friends, so things wouldn't be awkward. It was just me, Glenda, and Marcy. When Marcy showed up, she looked different. Not like the mess she had been the last time I saw her. She looked healthier. There was still something fragile about her, like she was barely holding it together, but at least she was trying. When Glenda saw her, she hesitated for a second, but then she ran over and hugged her. Marcy's eyes filled with tears as she wrapped her arms around her daughter, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a glimpse of the woman I used to know. "Hi baby," Marcy whispered, holding Glenda tight. "I've missed you so much." They sat in the living room, talking quietly while I gave them space. I wasn't sure how it would go, but it seemed like Glenda was happy to have her mom back, even if it was just for a short visit. Marcy kept it together, asking about school and Glenda's hobbies, doing her best to show she cared. It was bittersweet watching them together. Part of me still resented Marcy for everything she had done, but another part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, she could be a better mom this time. After about an hour, Marcy stood up to leave. She hugged Glenda again, promising to stay in touch and visit more often. I watched from the doorway as she walked to her car, her shoulders slumped slightly, like she was carrying the weight of all her past mistakes. Before she got in, she turned to me. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me see her." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. "Just don't screw it up again, Marcy. She deserves better." She looked down, nodding. "I know." As the weeks passed, Marcy did her best to stay involved in Glenda's life. She didn't always get it right, but at least she was showing up. Glenda seemed happier, more settled. I think she had missed her mom more than she had let on. I was careful, though. I made sure Marcy understood that this was her second chance, and if she blew it, there wouldn't be a third. Meanwhile, things with Janet continued to blossom. As her pregnancy progressed, we started getting the house ready for the baby. Glenda helped paint the nursery, picking out the softest yellow for the walls, saying it was a color that would make the baby happy. I couldn't argue with that logic. One day, while we were putting together the crib, Janet paused and looked at me, her hand resting on her growing belly. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" she asked. I smiled, nodding. "All the time. It's just crazy, isn't it?" she continued, her voice soft. "We both went through so much pain, and now here we are, starting a family together." I looked at her, my heart swelling with gratitude for everything we'd built. "Yeah, it's crazy. But it's the best kind of crazy." She laughed, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. We weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving. Later that evening, I tucked Glenda into bed. She was still buzzing with excitement over the baby, talking about all the things she was going to teach her new sibling. "Do you think the baby will like soccer?" she asked, her eyes wide. "I'm sure they will," I said, smiling. "But even if they don't, they'll have the best big sister to show them the ropes." Glenda beamed, pulling her blanket up to her chin. "I can't wait." I kissed her forehead and turned off the light, standing in the doorway for a moment, just watching her as she drifted off to sleep. She was growing up so fast, and despite everything, she was happy. I couldn't have asked for more. With the baby on the way, Marcy trying to be better, and our family growing stronger, I finally felt like we were heading into a new chapter, one filled with hope instead of hurt. The months flew by, and before we knew it, Janet was in the hospital, ready to bring our baby into the world. It was surreal, standing by her side, holding her hand, knowing that our lives were about to change again. The labor was long, but when I held our baby boy for the first time, all the chaos of the past felt distant, like it belonged to a different life. We named him Ethan. Glenda was over the moon, holding her little brother with such care, like she'd been waiting her whole life to be a big sister. Watching them together, I felt a wave of pride and peace wash over me. Marcy came by to visit a few days later. She was cautious, careful not to overstep, but she seemed genuinely happy for us. She hugged Glenda, congratulated Janet and me, and even held Ethan for a moment. It was strange seeing her in this new light, no longer the source of all my pain, but just another part of the past I was finally leaving behind. As Marcy left that day, she looked back and gave me a small smile, one that felt like it held some kind of understanding, maybe even closure. I nodded in return, and with that, she quietly walked away. In the weeks that followed, our house was filled with the usual chaos of life with a newborn, but it was the kind of chaos I welcomed. Glenda was adjusting to her new role as big sister, and Janet and I were settling into the rhythm of being parents together. Life felt full, in the best way possible. One night, as we sat together on the porch, Janet leaned her head on my shoulder, and we watched the stars, the baby monitor softly buzzing beside us. "Feels like we made it, huh?" she said, smiling. "Yeah," I replied, squeezing her hand. "We did. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. This was the life I had fought for, and it was better than I ever could have imagined."